Before we drift into tonight's tale of the entire story of Ice King, I'd love to know where in the world are you watching from tonight? And what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. It's always magical, seeing how far and wide this sleepy little community reaches. All right, lights low, blankets up, let's begin. Long before the land of Ooh came to life, long before candy people built kingdoms and liches whispered in the dark, there was simply a man. His name was Simon Petrikov. He wasn't a king, he wasn't a wizard, and he wasn't cursed. He was just a scholar, a man fascinated by history, by old relics, and by the way ancient civilizations left pieces of themselves scattered across the world like little breadcrumbs. Simon had gentle eyes, always hidden behind a pair of round glasses. He was not the sort of man to chase adventure for glory. Instead, he loved the quiet of dusty libraries and the thrill of opening a book no one had touched in centuries. He collected stories, objects, and fragments of the past because he wanted to preserve them, to keep them safe, and to understand the mysteries they carry. In those days, the world had not yet broken. The skies still held the steady rhythm of airplanes and radio towers, cities bustled with everyday noise, and people carried on with their lives unaware of how close the end truly was. Simon walked among them like any ordinary person. Yet he carried in his heart a passion that made him different. Where others saw worthless antiques, he saw a kind of magic hidden in history itself. Among the artifacts he gathered, one piece stood out. It wasn't grand or gleaming, at least not in the way a treasure might sparkle. It was a crown, weathered and strange, its jewels glimmering faintly in the light. At first, Simon thought of it as just another curious find, a relic to study, to catalog, and to perhaps pass on to a museum one day. But the crown was not like other objects. It seemed to hum with a presence of its own, whispering softly edge of his thoughts, pulling at him with an energy he couldn't quite explain. Simon had always prided himself on reason. He believed in science, in logic, in the clear and steady line of thought that separated reality from fantasy. Yet the crown blurred those lines. The first time he placed it on his head, perhaps in a moment of playfulness, perhaps in a moment of weakness, the world shifted. Colors bent. Shadows seemed to lean in, and voices murmured like the sound of waves crashing from very far away. When he lifted it off, the world returned to normal. But something inside Simon knew that it was not just a trick of the mind. The crown held power, dangerous and alluring. It frightened him, even as it filled him with awe. For a time, he tried to dismiss it. He tucked it away, telling himself it was only an artifact with unusual property. Yet he found himself returning to it, staring at it in quiet moments, wondering who had made such a thing and why. He wrote about it in his journals, carefully describing the visions, the odd pulses of energy, and the way it seemed to call his name when he was alone. And slowly Simon began to notice changes. They were small at first. A word would slip from his memory. A sudden shiver would pass through him, even in warm rooms. At night, dreams twisted into visions of ice and endless snow. He would wake with frost on his breath and the strange feeling that his mind was not entirely his own. Still, he carried on with his life. He continued his work, traveled, and even fell in love. Simon had someone who cared for him deeply, someone who believed in his gentle heart. Her name was Betty. She was bright, kind, and saw in Simon not just a scholar, but a soul full of warmth and curiosity. Together they dreamed of a future filled with exploration, with books and journeys, with quiet evenings spent sharing stories. But the crown was always there, like a shadow at the edge of their happiness. Simon tried to shield Betty from its influence. He rarely spoke of it, and when he did, he softened the detail. He didn't want her to see the fear it stirred in him. For Simon, the crown was both a puzzle and a weight, something he longed to understand, yet wished he had never touched. The more he resisted, the stronger its pull became. There were days when the visions grew so heavy that he locked himself away, afraid that Betty would see him trembling, speaking words that were not his own. He told himself that as long as he could write, as long as he could keep his mind grounded in ink and paper, he could resist. His journals filled with desperate notes, sketches of frozen landscapes, and warnings to anyone who might find the crown after. Simon Petrikov, once just a man with glasses and books, was standing at the edge of something much larger. He didn't yet know that the world around him would collapse, that wars would reshape the earth, and that the crown would become both his curse and his cage. At this point in his life, he was still Simon, a man who loved knowledge, a man who loved Betty, and a man fighting a quiet battle against a voice of ice that whispered promises he could never truly escape. Simon's journals from this period are some of the most haunting relics of the old world. Written in his neat, deliberate hand, they show the gradual unraveling of a man who wanted nothing more than to stay himself. At first, his notes were careful observations, like those of any scientist. He would write about the crown's temperature, its peculiar design, the exact hue of its gemstone. But slowly his words shifted. Sentences trailed into rambling, half-finished thoughts. Whole pages became sketches of jagged ice, frozen mountain, and strange figures with glowing eyes. The crown was not simply something Simon wore. It was something that began to wear him, and yet he clung to his humanity. He would buy flowers for Betty. He would make tea, humming quietly to himself while the kettle boiled, trying to ignore the way the frost sometimes gathered at the corners of the room. He laughed at her jokes, kissed her hand, and spoke of the future, even as that future slipped further away each time he felt the cold creep deeper into his bones. Simon was not a hero in the traditional sense. He wasn't a warrior, nor a man of great physical strength, but there was a kind of heroism in his resistance. Night after night, he fought the temptation to surrender completely to the crown. He reminded himself of who he was, of the love he carried, of the simple joys that made life worth living. And in those moments, you can almost imagine him as he once was, a man standing at the threshold of eternity, refusing to let it swallow him without a fight. Still, the whispers never stopped. They were patient, insistent. They promised power, promised safety, promised a way to endure the storms of a world that was beginning to fray at the edges. Simon sometimes wondered if the crown knew what was coming, if it had seen civilizations rise and fall before, and was merely guiding him toward the role it had always intended for. Betty noticed the changes, of course. She wasn't blind to the shadows beneath his eyes, the way his hands sometimes trembled when he held hers. But love is often stronger than fear. She chose to believe in Simon's goodness, to stand beside him, even as the world grew colder around them. And perhaps, in some quiet way, that devotion kept Simon anchored longer than he otherwise might have been. For every moment he slipped into icy vision, there was Betty's voice pulling him back, reminding him of warmth, of love, of what it meant to be human. But the crown was patient. It didn't need to rush. Time was on its side. And while Simon fought, the world outside was changing in ways no one could have imagined. Rumors of conflict stirred. Weapons unlike any before were built, tested, and unleashed. Humanity had always flirted with the idea of self-destruction, and now that shadow loomed larger with every passing day. For Simon, though, these were distant worries. His greatest enemy was already sitting on the desk in his study, waiting for the moment he would once again place it on his head. Each time he wore it, the visions lasted longer. Each time he lost a little more of himself. Yet he also found he could not entirely resist. The crown gave him glimpses of power, of survival. It froze the air, bent the cold, and created ice where there had been none. He told himself it might be useful one day, a tool in desperate times. That lie soothed him, even as it bound him more tightly to the crown's will. There's something achingly human in that struggle. To know something is harmful, to know it is consuming you, and yet to reach for it anyway because you cannot bear the thought of what might happen without it. Simon's story at this is not just the tale of a cursed object. It is the tale of a man trying and failing to balance love, survival, and obsession. He recorded everything because he feared forgetting, but already the edges of his memory were blurring. He would write a date and then cross it out, unsure if it was right. He would begin a sentence about Betty, only to end it speaking of voices in the snow. He would sketch her face, but the lines would twist into icy pattern, her eyes replaced with shards of blue crystal. Simon was slipping, and he knew it. And yet he kept smiling for Betty. He kept reading to her, holding her hand, pretending that everything was still the same. It was his last act of love, to hide the storm inside his mind so she wouldn't have to carry the weight of it. But even the strongest walls eventually crack. One day Betty would see the crown's effect in full, and Simon, despite all his resistance, would realize he could no longer protect her from what he was becoming. Simon's days grew stranger as time went on. Sometimes he would be walking home from a lecture or an afternoon in the archives, and the world around him would shimmer. A street full of cars and voices would suddenly feel silent, as though it were trapped beneath a frozen lake. The air turned sharp in his lungs, his vision blurred with snowflakes that weren't really there, and he could hear the faint cracking of ice echoing through his skull. Then, just as suddenly, the illusion would vanish, leaving Simon trembling and clutching the edge of a doorway to steady him. He told himself these were just fainting spells, the result of exhaustion or stress. But deep down, he knew better. The crown was etching itself into his mind. It was not simply an object he could set aside. It was living with him, haunting him, reshaping him, even when it rested untouched in its box. Betty began to notice more often. She asked questions gently, never pressing, but Simon could see the worry in her eyes. He would reassure her with soft words, pulling her into his arms, promising that he was fine, that it was only overwork. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to hold on to the man she loved, the one who would smile with quiet delight whenever he found a rare book or discovered a fragment of forgotten history. But Betty was clever, and Simon knew it. He could not hide forever. There were evenings when she would catch him staring at the crown for too long, his expression distant, as though he were listening to someone she could not hear. Once she even touched his shoulder, and he startled so violently that the lamp on the table crashed to the floor. He laughed it off, but his hands were shaking, and Betty, with her patient heart, simply held him until the trembling passed. The truth is, Simon was terrified, not of the crown's power, not even of death, but of the slow erasure of himself. To forget who he was, to forget Betty, to forget the small joys that defined his humanity. That was the fate he feared most. And yet every time he thought of locking the crown away forever, a cold whisper would remind him of how dangerous the world was becoming. War brewed beyond the cities, strange weapons were being tested, and tensions between nations ran high. In that fragile climate, the crown's promise of survival felt almost rational. If everything collapsed, if the world burned, wouldn't it be better to have some tool to endure it? Simon was a scholar, but he was also human. And like any human, faced with uncertainty, he clung to anything that offered hope, even if that hope came with chains. He poured himself into his work as though it could anchor him. He gave lectures, wrote papers, and corresponded with colleagues who admired his brilliance. To them, Simon was still a respected academic, eccentric but brilliant, with a charming smile hidden beneath his awkwardness. None of them knew that when he returned home, his mind was fraying. His nights were sleepless, and his study was filled with sketches of frozen worlds that didn't exist, at least not yet. Sometimes he would dream of a place made entirely of ice, towers that glittered like glass, halls that rang with empty echoes, a throne waiting in silence. In these dreams, Simon was not afraid. He was powerful, majestic, worshipped. But when he woke, the chill clung to him, and he would sit for hours in bed, staring at his hands, wondering how long they would still be his own. Betty's love was the brightest warmth those days. She reminded him to laugh, to eat, to go outside when he would have locked himself away in his study. They planned small adventures, afternoons at museums, walks along quiet streets, picnics with worn-out books spread around them like blankets. In those moments, Simon could almost believe he was safe, that the crown was only a bad dream. But the cracks always showed. Once during a picnic, Betty reached to brush a crumb from his cheek, and Simon flinched as though her touch might shatter him. He apologized over and over, blaming nerves, but he knew it was the crown again, weaving its cold between them. And so Simon began to write letters, not to Betty, though he wanted to, but to the world itself. He filled notebooks with warnings, explanations, confessions. If he were to lose himself completely, if the man named Simon Petrikov were to vanish, then at least his words might remain. It was a desperate attempt at immortality, not of power, but of memory. He wanted someone, someday, to know that he had tried. There is something deeply tender in this period of his life. a man standing in the doorway between two worlds, one of warmth, love, and humanity, and another of cold, endless silence. He longed to choose the first, but the second kept creeping closer, its icy breath fogging up the glass of his days. And though Simon resisted with all his strength, the crown was patient. It had waited centuries, perhaps millennia. It could wait a little longer for the man it had chosen to finally surrender. As the world outside drifted closer to war, Simon and Betty's lives became more fragile. News reports whispered of devastation, of weapons no one could fully understand. People began to stockpile food, to plan for a future no one wanted to face. Simon watched all of this with quiet dread, clutching the crown tighter as though it were the only certainty left. And in a way, he was right. The crown was certainty. It was destiny, and soon it would no longer be something he could resist. The days leading into the end of the old world felt strangely quiet, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Simon and Betty went about their lives, but every headline carried a weight of dread. Nations quarreled with words dipped in fire. Experiments in laboratories whispered of destruction that could not be undone. The Mushroom War was not yet called by that name, but its shadow was already stretching across the world. Simon, ever the scholar, saw the signs. He collected reports, clipped newspaper articles, and scribbled notes in the margin. He understood, perhaps more than most, what was coming. He would look at Betty in those moments, the candlelight flickering across her face, and wonder if she could see the same storm that he saw. But he never said it aloud. To voice it would make it real, and for Betty's sake, he wanted to hold on to normalcy for as long as he could. The crown, however, seemed to grow louder with every passing day. Its whispers became more insistent, no longer content to lurk in the shadows of his mind. Sometimes, while Simon sat at his desk, the crown's voice would cut through his thoughts like a shard of ice, promising him survival, urging him to wear it again. He resisted, but only for so long. Each time the tension outside their home grew heavier, Simon felt his will bend a little more. It was during one of these moments of weakness that Betty saw the full weight of the crown's curse. Simon had placed it on his head again, telling himself it would only be for a moment. But when she entered the room, she found him frozen in place, his eyes glowing faintly, his breath curling into mist, even though the room was warm. He was speaking words she did not understand, a language older than any she had ever heard. Betty's voice broke through the haze, and Simon pulled the crown off, collapsing to the floor, shivering and terrified. That was the moment Betty knew the truth. The crown was not simply an artifact. It was alive, hungry, and cruel. And Simon, the man she loved, was being consumed. She pleaded with him to destroy it, to cast it away, but Simon could not. He tried to explain, with tears trembling in his voice, that the world was crumbling, that the crown might be the only thing that could keep them safe when everything else fell apart. Betty looked at him, saw the man behind the fear, and understood. She did not forgive the crown, but she chose to stay by Simon's side, even as the shadows lengthened. The days after that moment felt stolen, like fragile glass moments balanced on the edge of a blade. Simon and Betty shared quiet meals, whispered reassurances, and spent long hours together as though savoring every second. But Simon knew deep in his heart that he was losing the battle. Each time he touched the crown, the memories of who he was slipped a little further away. Sometimes he would forget simple things, where he had left a book, what day it was, or even Betty's name, just for a heartbeat. He would catch himself, smile nervously, brushing it off, but Betty saw the cracks widening. The Mushroom War struck like a thunderclap across the world. Cities burned, skies blackened, and weapons of unimaginable power tore the earth apart. For those who survived, nothing would ever be the same. Amid the chaos, Simon clutched the crown, the one relic that could shield him, and by extension, protect Betty. But survival came at a cost. Each time he wore it to push back the dangers of this broken new world, more of Simon's mind slipped into the cold grip of the crown. One night when the bombs had fallen, and silence replaced the noise of civilization, Simon sat with Betty in a small, ruined shelter. He told her, in a trembling voice, that he was scared, not of the war, not even of death, but of what he was becoming. He begged her forgiveness in advance, knowing that one day she might look into his eyes and see only a stranger. Betty held him tightly, whispering that love does not vanish, even when memory does. But her tears betrayed her fear. Soon after, Betty herself would be pulled into the storm of destiny. She would make her own desperate choices, sacrifices born of love and obsession. But for Simon, this was the beginning of the end. He had once been a man of books, of laughter, of gentle curiosity. Now he was a man haunted by voices of ice, wandering the ruins of a dying world with only his willpower holding him together. And yet, through all of this, Simon's heart remained fragile and human. Even as the crown froze his thoughts and bent his will, he clung to the memory of Betty's smile, to the sound of her laughter echoing in his ear. It was the last light within him, flickering against the encroaching darkness. That light would keep him moving forward even when the world fell silent. The man before the crown was not a villain, not a fool, not even a king. He was simply Simon Petrikov, a scholar who loved too deeply, who feared too greatly, and who stumbled into a fate too heavy for any one person to bear. His tragedy began not in the moment he first froze the land of U, but here in these final fragile days of the old world, when he was still just a man trying to hold on to love as everything else slipped away. And soon the story would shift. The world would be gone, replaced with ruins and silence. Simon, struggling against the crown, would find himself with a child at his side, a girl who had lost everything, a girl he would protect even as his mind crumbled. Her name was Marceline, and she would be the last piece of humanity Simon could cling to as the crown pulled him further into its frozen depths. When the Mushroom War finally erupted in full, it was not with the sound of one great explosion, but with a chain of disasters, each one feeding into the next. The skies darkened with ash. Cities that once glowed with neon lights and laughter were swallowed in flame, and whole landscapes were reshaped in the blink of an eye. It was not the end of the world in a single day, but the beginning of a long unraveling. Humanity had stepped too far into its own shadow, and now that shadow covered everything. Simon wandered through this changing world with the crown held tightly in his arms, a burden and a shield. He had no illusions anymore. The whispers in his mind were constant now, cold as winter winds, promising him safety if only he would give himself over. And though he hated it, he had little choice but to listen. The war had left the streets dangerous and broken. Food grew scarce, shelter was temporary, and in every ruined corner something hungry waited. Betty was gone by then. Her story had taken a different path, drawn by her determination to save Simon in her own way. He carried her memory like a flame in his chest, but he walked alone except for the crown, which clung to him like a parasite. And so Simon Petrikov, scholar and historian, became a figure wandering through ruins with a jeweled crown whispering madness in his ear. There was a time when he still tried to resist its power. He told himself he would only wear it in moments of true desperation. But desperation was everywhere. When raiders cornered him in the shell of a half-destroyed building, he felt his trembling hands lift the crown to his head. The world shifted instantly. A cold clarity filled his veins, and jagged spires of ice erupted around him, piercing the air with a crystalline sound. The raiders fled in terror, but Simon remained, his breath clouding in the frozen air, his eyes wide with horror at what he had done. Each time he wore the crown, it became harder to take it off. The ice did not just protect him, it comforted him. It dulled the grief of Betty's absence. It shielded him from the despair of watching the world crumble. And yet, when he did remove it, the weight of sorrow returned tenfold, leaving him weak, broken, and more tempted than before to surrender completely. He began to speak to himself in the ruins, at first in his own voice, then in voices he did not recognize. The crown seemed to draw other presences into his mind, ancient, foreign, and cruel. They whispered of kingdoms built on frost, of eternity carved from snow, of thrones where he would never be alone. Simon would clutch his head, writing furiously his journals, desperate to separate his thoughts from theirs. But the line blurred more with each passing day. Still, even as the world collapsed, there were sparks of humanity left within him. He would come across families huddled in the dark, or children crying in the cold, and something inside him would stir. He gave what little food he had, offered blankets, and when the dangers grew too close, he would risk the crown again to drive them away. In those moments, Simon felt both the curse and the gift as fate. He was losing himself, but he was also saving others. It was this fragile balance that kept him moving forward. The landscapes around him became unrecognizable. Where once there were forests of green, now twisted shapes rose, scarred by bombs and poisoned skies. Rivers ran black with ash, and the air carried a silence broken only by the distant crash of collapsing towers. Simon wandered through these places like a ghost, his scarf whipping in the wind, his eyes searching for any sign of hope. But hope was scarce, and the crown, patient as ever, reminded him that he need not suffer, that if he only let go of Simon Petrikov, if he allowed himself to become the Ice King it promised, then he would no longer feel this grief, this fear, this loneliness. Simon resisted, for now, but he knew the day would come when resistance would not be enough. And it was in this fragile, shifting world that Simon's path would cross with a child who had lost everything. A little girl with wild hair, clutching a battered toy, wandering alone in the ruins. Her name was Marceline, and she would change everything. Simon first found her in the ruins of a half-destroyed neighborhood, where the windows of homes stared back like hollow eyes. He had heard the faintest sound, a small, trembling cry, and followed it cautiously through the wreckage. There, tucked beneath the broken frame of a collapsed billboard, was a child. Her face was smudged with soot, her clothes torn, but her eyes still burned with life. She hugged a battered toy, a ragged little Hambo doll, as if it were the only thing tethering her to the world. For a moment, Simon simply stood there, uncertain. The crown whispered that she was nothing, that she was weak and in the way, that survival meant leaving her behind. But the man inside him, the part that still remembered Betty, the part that still believed in love and kindness, knelt down and reached out a hand. "It's all right," he said softly, his voice breaking. "You're safe now." Marceline hesitated, clutching Hambo tighter, but her eyes, wide and wet, met his. Slowly she placed her small hand into his, and with that fragile gesture, Simon Petrikov became something he had not been since the war began. He became a protector. From then on, the world was no longer only about his survival. Every step he took was measured by the need to keep this child alive. He scavenged abandoned stores for food, guided her through ruins, and wrapped her in his scarf when the nights grew cold. Marceline, in turn, followed him, with the kind of trust only a child could give, believing that this strange, weary man with kind eyes would keep the darkness away. But protecting her meant using the crown more often. Monsters roamed the wasteland, mutated remnants of the war, twisted shapes born from radiation, and magic leaking into the soil. When they appeared, Simon could not fight them with his bare hands. He had to wear the crown. He had to call upon the ice. The first time Marceline saw him do it, her eyes filled with fear. She watched as the man who had taken her hand transformed, his breath frosty, his eyes glowing like frozen stars. Jagged spears of ice rose around them, shattering the ground and sending the creatures fleeing. When it was over, Simon pulled the crown from his head, gasping, clutching it to his chest as though it were a curse and a lifeline both. He turned to Marceline then, desperate to reassure her, to remind her that he was still himself. She stood silently, clutching Hambo, and after a long moment, she whispered, "Don't leave me." Those 3 words anchored Simon in a way nothing else could. No matter how much the crown clawed at his mind, no matter how many voices whispered in the back of his skull, he could not abandon her. He promised her, in a voice trembling with both fear and determination, that he would never leave her alone. Together, they wandered a world that was no longer theirs. They slept in crumbling buildings, ate scraps when they could find them, and sang quietly to drown out the silence. Simon would strum a broken guitar or hum lullabies, and Marceline would lean against him, her small hand clutching his sleeve. In those moments, the war felt far away, and Simon felt like a father. But the crown's grip deepened. Each time he used it to protect her, each time he surrendered to its power, Simon felt less like himself when he returned. His words sometimes slurred, his thoughts scattered. Marceline would tug on his sleeve, asking why he was crying, and he would shake his head, unable to explain that he wasn't sure if the tears belonged to him or to the ice. The land itself reflected his unraveling. Ice would linger where he had fought, frost creeping over shattered walls, snow dusting the ruins where no winter had ever touched before. It was as if the crown was extending its dominions piece by piece, reshaping the world to its image. And still, Simon clung to Marceline. She was his reason to resist, the one thread tying him to humanity. Each morning when she woke and smiled at him, he remembered that he was still Simon Petrikov, still a man who could choose love over madness. But as the days grew colder, both literally and within his mind, he wondered how long he could keep that promise. For though the world had already ended once, Simon knew his own end was still ahead. The crown was patient, and it would not rest until it had claimed him completely. There were nights when the silence of the ruined world seemed heavier than the cold. Simon and Marceline would find shelter in abandoned houses, their walls cracked and ceilings sagging, but still offering a place to rest. Marceline would curl up close to him, clutching Hambo, while Simon sat awake with the crown resting uneasily at his side. He would stare at it in the dim glow of a flickering fire, his reflection caught in the curve of its jewel. Sometimes he thought he saw other faces twisted with cruelty frozen in time. When sleep finally did claim him, it came with dreams of endless snow. He would see a palace of ice stretching into the sky, staircases that spiraled upward into nowhere, and a throne at its center waiting, always waiting. He would wake, gasping, clutching his chest, and Marceline would stir beside him, her small voice asking if he was all right. He always smiled for her, always whispered it was fine, but inside he wondered how much longer he could keep his grip on reality. The crown's whispers grew bolder, no longer content to haunt the edges of his thoughts. It spoke directly to him, promising power, promising safety, promising that Marceline would never suffer as long as he obeyed. And there were times, in the face of monsters or starvation, when Simon almost believed it. He would place the crown upon his head, and the world would obey him. Ice surged at his command, walls of frost shielding them, weapons of jagged crystal driving back whatever danger lurked in the shadow. But the cost was always the same. When the battle ended, and he pulled the crown off, his mind felt like shattered glass. His words tumbled out in fragments, his memory slipped, and his body trembled with exhaustion. Marceline would sit beside him quietly, her eyes filled with worry, far too old for someone so young. She would take his hand, squeezing it gently, and whisper that she was still there, that she believed in it. It was those words, that unwavering trust, that kept Simon from surrendering completely. He began to think of Marceline as his daughter, though he never said it aloud. She gave him a reason to endure, a reason to keep one foot in humanity, even as the crown tried to drag him into its frozen abyss. And for Marceline, Simon became more than a protector. He was her only family in a world that had taken everything else. Their bond was fragile, but unbreakable, woven through nights of shared songs and days of scavenging for food. Simon would hum old tunes, his voice cracked but soft, while Marceline listened with her head resting on his arm. Sometimes she would join in, her voice small but strong, and together their music filled the ruins with something the war had almost erased, hope. Yet the cracks in Simon's mind widened. He began forgetting simple things, words, directions, even moments they had shared. Once he called Marceline by Betty's name, and when he realized what he had said, he broke down, clutching his head and begging forgiveness from both women at once. Marceline held him, whispering that it was all right, that she understood, though her young heart ached with confusion. The land itself mirrored Simon's struggle. Where he walked, frost lingered. Where he fought, snow began to fall. It was as if the crown was using him to lay the foundations of a kingdom he had never asked for. The world was already scarred by fire and ruin, but around Simon, the cold took root, carving its own dominion. Despite this, Simon still clung to his journals. He wrote when he could, recording not just his research, but his fears, his moments of clarity, and his desperate love for Marceline. He wanted her to know, should he lose himself completely, that he had tried, that every choice, every mistake, every time he surrendered to the crown, had been for her survival. His handwriting grew shakier with each entry. words slipping into strange symbols, sentences repeating like echoes. Still, he wrote, it was his last tether to the man he had once been. One evening, as the sun set over a landscape of twisted ruins, Simon and Marceline sat together on the rooftop of a broken house. The air was cool, the horizon painted with fading orange light. Marceline leaned against it, her tiny hand wrapped around his sleeve, and whispered that she was scared of the dark. Simon placed his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close, and told her a story about stars. He explained, in the gentle voice of a scholar, that stars were like guardians, shining so we never had to be truly afraid of night. Marceline looked up at the sky, her fears softening into wonder, and Simon felt a flicker of peace. For that moment, he was not a man haunted by a cursed crown. He was simply Simon Petrikov, telling a story to a little girl who needed him. But peace never lasted long. The world was dangerous, and the crown was always waiting. Simon knew he was standing on the edge of a precipice, and one day he would fall. As the days bled into weeks, Simon felt his grip on himself thinning, like threads pulled loose from a sweater. Each use of the crown left deeper cracks. He would forget conversations he'd had only hours earlier, lose track of where they were headed, or drift into muttering strange phrases in voices that weren't his own. Sometimes he would laugh suddenly, the sound sharp and unnatural, and Marceline would look at him with wide eyes until he caught himself and forced a gentler smile. She had begun to notice the difference between Simon and the man the crown made him. She would tug on his sleeve when the ice lingered too long in his voice, or when his eyes glowed faintly in the twilight. "Come back," he would whisper, and the words cut through the fog just enough for him to pull the crown off, clutching it in trembling hands. Her voice became his lifeline. The anchor pulling him back was about to drift too far into the cold. But the war-scarred land was merciless, and the dangers grew greater. Strange creatures prowled the ruins, mutations born from magic and radiation. Some were small and skittering, others towering and grotesque. Simon could not protect Marceline from them without the crown, and each battle chipped away at what little humanity he had left. In saving her life, he was slowly losing his own. One day, after driving off a pack of twisted beasts with walls of jagged ice, Simon collapsed. He lay in the snow he had created, gasping, his body racked with shivers that came not from the cold, but from the war inside his mind. Marceline knelt beside him, placing Hambo gently on his chest, as though the toy could shield him too. She begged him to stay, begged him not to go away like everyone else had. Her tears froze against his sleeve, and Simon felt his heart breaking in ways the crown could not numb. It was then he realized the truth. If he continued like this, if he let the crown devour him completely, while Marceline was still by his side, he might one day harm her. The thought alone was unbearable. To protect her, he would have to make the hardest choice of his life, not to cling, but to let go. So Simon began to prepare Marceline, gently, quietly, without telling her what he was doing. He taught her songs to sing when she was scared, showed her how to find safe places to sleep, how to tell when food was spoiled. He carried her on his shoulders when she was tired, humming to soothe her, but all the while his heart ached with the knowledge that he could not do this forever. The crown's whispers grew relentless. It told him he was already gone, that Simon Petrikov was just a memory, and that the Ice King was all that remained. At night, when Marceline slept, Simon would pace in circles, muttering back at the voices, refusing to surrender. He clung to the memory of Betty, to the warmth of Marceline's hand, to every shred of humanity he could still feel. But he knew the crown would win eventually. The moment came on a quiet evening. They had taken shelter in the hollow shell of an old bus, its windows shattered, its seats torn. Marceline fell asleep, curled up against him. Hambo pressed to her chest. Simon watched her breathing, steady and calm, and realized this might be the last time he could see her with his own eyes. Simon's eyes, not the crown. He kissed her forehead gently, whispering that he loved her, though she was too deep in dreams to hear. Then he slipped away into the night, carrying the crown with him. His steps were heavy, but his mind was clear in that single moment. He could not risk being by her side when the crown finally claimed him. Better she remember him as the man who kept her safe, who told her stories and sang her lullabies, than as the monster he was becoming. He left her with Hambo, her beloved toy, as both comfort and farewell. It was his way of saying she would never truly be alone. And then he placed the crown upon his head, surrendering to the cold, letting it carry him away from Simon Petrikov and into something else entirely. The man was gone, and the Ice King began to take shape. Yet even in that transformation, something fragile endured. Deep within the blizzard of madness, the echo of Simon's love for Marceline remained, buried but not destroyed. It would flicker through the century, surfacing in rare moments, when Ice King's rambling broke into sudden clarity. That hidden ember of humanity would never fully vanish, no matter how much the crown tried to erase it. The fall of the world had torn everything apart. Nations had collapsed, the skies had grown dark, and magic bled into the soil, birthing a strange new land. And within that chaos, Simon Petrikov, scholar, lover, protector, was no more. In his place stood the Ice King, a lonely monarch of frost, cursed to wander the ruins of his own choices. But Marceline lived on. She carried his songs, his scarf, and the memory of the man who had saved her when no one else could. Their bond would echo through the ages, tying her to the Ice King long after Simon himself was lost. The fall of the world had ended one story, but another was only beginning. The ruins of the old world were vast and silent, but within that silence, two figures carried on. A man in a worn scarf carrying the weight of a cursed crown, and a little girl with tangled hair and a toy she never let go of. Together, Simon and Marceline wandered the wasteland, side by side, bound not by blood but by need, love, and the fragile comfort they found in each other. As to Tim, for Marceline, Simon was the closest thing to a father she had ever known. He held her hand when the nights grew too dark, sang to her when fear threatened to overwhelm her, and offered every scrap of food he could find, even when his own stomach ached with hunger. To her, he was safety. To him, she was purpose. The wasteland they traveled through was both haunting and strangely beautiful. The skeletons of cities stood like monuments to a forgotten age, their glass towers cracked and bent, vines already curling through the cracks. Cars lay abandoned on broken roads, their headlights shattered, their doors hanging open. The sky was often choked with gray clouds, but when the sun broke through, the light turned everything golden, as though the world itself was trying to remember how to be alive again. Simon taught Marceline how to navigate this strange new land. He showed her where to look for food, how to tell if water was safe to drink, and how to listen for the faintest hints of danger in the silence. But he also gave her something rarer, the gift of story. He would describe what the world had been like before the war. Parks filled with laughter, music echoing in city streets, libraries stacked with books waiting to be read. Marceline would listen with wide eyes, imagining places she had never seen, building pictures of a world that no longer existed. At night, when they found shelter, Simon would hum songs to lull her to sleep. Sometimes he would take out a battered instrument, plucking at the strings until soft melodies filled the ruined room. Marceline would curl up close, Hambo clutched to her chest, and her eyelids would grow heavy as the music carried her into dream. For those moments, the wasteland outside faded away, replaced by the warmth of their bond. But beneath those tender moments, Simon's struggle never ceased. Each day was a battle to remain himself. The crown's whispers never left him, creeping in at the edges of his thoughts, even when he smiled at Marceline. He wore it when danger loomed, when hunger or insters forced his hand, but each time it drained him more. The moments of clarity afterward grew shorter, and Marceline noticed. She would tug on his sleeve when his words began to slur, or when his laughter turned strange, reminding him to take the crown off before it could steal him further away. And Simon listened, because her voice was the only thing that could still pull him back. In her presence, he remembered what mattered. She was the thread binding him to his humanity, the reason he still fought, the reason he still believed in love even when the world had been stripped of almost everything else. They became a pair of wanderers, but more than that, they became a family, not one defined by bloodlines or heritage, but by shared survival and shared love. The wasteland could not take that from them, no matter how much it tried. Yet even as they grew closer, Simon knew the truth. His time was running short. The crown was not something he could resist forever. And though he gave Marceline everything he had, from his stories to his scarf, he carried a fear deep inside that one day the man she called her protector would vanish, and in his place only a stranger of ice and madness would remain. For now, though, they had each other, and in the wasteland, that was enough. There were days when the wasteland seemed almost kind to them, days when they found cans of food still sealed, or stumbled upon a stream clear enough to drink from. On those rare mornings, Marceline would laugh, her voice bright against the emptiness, and Simon would feel his heart lift. He would lift her onto his shoulders, and together they would march through the ruins as though they were explorers rather than survivors. For a brief moment, they could pretend that the world was still wide and wonderful. But there were other days, darker ones, when the land itself seemed hostile. Storms of ash swept across broken highways, forcing them to huddle together beneath scraps of cloth. Strange creatures with glowing eyes stalked them in the night, drawn by the faint crackle of their fires. And always hunger gnawed at their stomachs, a constant reminder of how fragile they truly were. In those moments, Simon had no choice but to rely on the crown. He would place it on his head with trembling hands, and the world would shift into a realm of ice. Spikes of frost erupted from the ground, monsters froze in place, and the air filled with the sharp sound of cracking ice. Marceline would clutch Hambo, watching her protector transform into something both awe-inspiring and terrifying. When the danger passed, Simon would fall to his knees, pulling the crown from his head, his body shaking. Marceline would rush to his side, wrapping her small arms around him, whispering that it was all right. But in those moments, she could see the toll it took. His eyes lingered too long on the crown, his words came out broken, and his laughter sometimes slipped into a tone that didn't belong to him. Despite the fear, Marceline never left his side. To her, Simon was not a monster. He was the man who told her stories when she cried, who sang to her when she couldn't sleep, who carried her when her legs were too tired to keep going. She believed in him, even when he struggled to believe in himself. Their bond grew in the smallest of ways. Marceline began to mimic his habits, scribbling drawings on scraps of paper like his journal entry, or humming his songs in her own playful voice. Simon, in turn, treated her with tenderness, brushing her hair when he patching her clothes with threads scavenged from old shops, and always giving her the last bite of food no matter how hungry he was. In a world stripped of kindness, they made their own, yet the wasteland pressed down on them. There were nights when Simon's resolve faltered, when he stared at the crown longer than he should, wondering if it would be easier to let it consume him completely. No more pain, no more fear, no more grief. But then Marceline would lean against him, her small hand finding his, and the choice became clear again. For her, he had to keep fighting. Simon began to call her his little girl, a phrase that slipped out naturally one day as he handed her a piece of scavenged candy. Marceline's face lit up, and from then on she clung to the name, repeating it whenever she wanted his attention. In those words, Simon found something sacred. She wasn't just someone he protected. She was his daughter in every way that mattered. Together they carved out small islands of peace in a sea of chaos, singing songs, telling stories, and dreaming about a future that might never come. Simon knew he could not hold on to himself forever, but as long as Marceline looked at him with those trusting eyes, he would endure. The days stretched onward, blurring into one another. Sometimes Simon wondered if time itself had begun to dissolve in the aftermath of the war. Without calendars, without clocks, each sunrise was only another reminder that they had made it through the night. For Marceline, this rhythm became her childhood. Instead of playgrounds and schoolroom, she learned survival by Simon's side. Instead of fairy tales told in warm homes, she heard his voice recount the past, weaving stories of music halls, libraries, and theaters that had all turned to rubble. Simon tried to shield her from the worst of the wasteland, but Marceline was clever. She could see the exhaustion in his shoulders, the cracks in his smile. She began to notice when he slipped into strange moods, his voice grew sharp, or his words lost their meaning. She would tug gently on his sleeve, whispering his name until he returned. To her young eyes, it was like waking him from a dream. To Simon, it was being pulled back from a precipice he was always moments away from falling over. One evening, after a long day of wandering, They found shelter in the shell of an old grocery store. The shelves were mostly bare, but Simon scavenged enough to put together a small meal. He sat Marceline on a broken counter, handing her a tin of food, and as she ate, he tried to smile. She looked at him, her small face serious, and asked if he was sick. The question caught him off guard. He opened his mouth to reassure her, but his throat closed. Instead, he set the crown aside and knelt down, wrapping his arms around her. "I'll be here as long as I can." Marceline didn't press further. She only hugged him tighter, as if that alone could keep him from slipping away. Simon's journals grew more frantic during this time. Where once he had filled them with careful notes and observations, now his entries spiraled into desperate scrawl. He wrote of hearing voices in the snow, of seeing flashes of icy palaces in his waking hours. The handwriting often broke into jagged lines, letters twisted and uneven, yet scattered among the madness were words of devotion, reminders to Marceline, confessions of love for Betty, pleas to anyone who might one day find his writings and understand that he had tried. Despite the decline, Simon and Marceline carved out fragile moments of joy. They played simple games, tossing pebbles into circles drawn in the dirt. They sang songs under broken bridges, their voices echoing softly through the empty space. Marceline sometimes laughed until she couldn't breathe, and the sound was so pure that Simon felt warmth return to his chest. In those fleeting instants, he almost believed they could make it, that love and laughter could outlast even the weight of the crown. But the Wasteland had little patience for peace. One night, they were cornered by a hulking creature, its body twisted with mutation, eyes glowing like embers. Simon acted without hesitation. He placed the crown on his head, summoning a storm of ice that lashed against the monster with deadly precision. The creature fled, howling into the dark, but when the battle ended, Simon did not remove the crown immediately. His laughter filled the night, sharp and wild, and Marceline froze in terror. She called his name again and again, her voice breaking, until at last he tore the crown from his head and collapsed into the snow. When he looked up, Marceline's eyes were wet with tears. She clutched Hambo close, her small frame trembling. Simon crawled toward her, desperate, whispering apology. "I'm still me. I'm still here." She let him hold her, but in her silence, Simon understood the truth. Every time he wore the crown, he risked losing the part of himself that Marceline trusted most. It was this fear that began to change the way he spoke to her. He told her more stories, not just of the old world, but of her strength, of how brave she was, of how she would one day grow to face the world without him. He wanted to prepare her, though he never said the words outright. Marceline listened quietly, nodding, though she did not yet understand the weight of what he was saying. The bond between them grew deeper with each passing trial. Marceline was no longer only a child relying on Simon. She was his anchor, the one presence that kept him tethered to who he was. Without her, he might have surrendered to the crown long ago. With her, he still fought, still clung to the hope that Simon Petrikov was not entirely gone. But each dawn reminded him that the crown was patient and that his strength was finite. And though Simon never stopped fighting, he knew the day was approaching when his humanity would no longer be enough to keep the ice at bay. The wasteland stretched on endlessly, and though Simon tried to make it feel like an adventure, Marceline could sense the heaviness in his steps. His body grew thinner, his face more hollow, his hands shaking even when he tried to hide it. At times he would stare at nothing for long stretches, lost in visions only he could see. Marceline would tug gently on his sleeve to bring him back, and he would smile, but his eyes carried the sadness of a man who knew his time was slipping away. Despite this, Simon gave Marceline everything he could. He gave her his scarf on cold nights, even when he shivered without it. He gave her food, saving the smallest scraps for himself. He gave her songs, his voice weak but steady, so that she would fall asleep to music instead of fear. And most of all, he gave her love, unconditional and constant, even when his mind was breaking apart. Marceline grew braver. She began to walk ahead sometimes, searching ruins with confidence. She would point out places to shelter or laugh when she found small treasures, buttons, marbles, scraps of cloth that she could weave into little keepsakes. Simon encouraged her, proud of her growing strength, though each smile hid his sorrow. He wanted her to learn, to be strong, because he knew he might not always be there. but the crown's grip tightened every day. When Simon wore it now, the transformation came faster. His eyes burned with icy light, his laughter turned jagged, and the air around him grew so cold that frost spread across the ground wherever he walked. Marceline, brave as she was, grew frightened of these moments. She would plead with him to take the crown off, clutching Hambo and begging for her Simon to return. Most of the time he did, falling into her arms in tears, whispering apology she should never have had to hear. But there were times when he hesitated, staring into the distance as though he no longer recognized her. One evening, after such a moment, Simon realized what he had to do. They had taken refuge in a crumbling theater, its stage long abandoned, its seats covered in dust. As Marceline slept curled beside him, Simon wrote by the faint light of a candle. His hands trembled. His words slipped into incoherence, but the message was clear enough. He loved her. He wanted her to live, to be strong, to carry on even if he could not. When he set down the pen, his tears stained the page. In the morning, he tried to act as though nothing had changed. He carried Marceline on his shoulders, told her a story about a world where children played in parks filled with flowers, and sang her favorite lullaby when she grew tired. But inside, he was saying goodbye. The moment came quietly. They had found an old bus again, rusted and broken, but safe enough to rest in. Simon wrapped Marceline in his scarf, kissed her forehead, and told her to sleep. She drifted off with Hambo in her arms, her small breaths steady. Simon watched her for a long time, committing every detail to memory. Then, with a heart heavy as stone, he stepped outside with the crown in his hand. He knew he could not stay. The crown would take him soon, and if he remained by Marceline's side, it might one day turn his love into harm. Better to leave her with memories of the man who protected her than to let her see him become the monster he feared. He whispered a final promise into the night air, that she would never truly be alone. And then, with tears freezing on his cheeks, he placed the crown on his head once more. When Marceline awoke, Simon was gone. All that remained was Hambo pressed into her arms, and the memory of the man who had walked beside her through the fire and ruin. She did not yet understand the depth of his sacrifice, but she carried his love with her, and in time, it would shape the woman she became. The Wasteland had taken almost everything from her, but it had given her Simon Petrikov for a time, and though the crown stole him away, the bond they forged remained unbreakable. In every song she sang, in every memory she carried, Simon's love endured. The father and daughter of the Wasteland walked together only for a while, but their story stretched far beyond those ruined years, echoing into the heart of Ooh itself. Simon had become something else, someone Marceline could barely recognize. Yet deep within the Ice King, the ember of Simon's devotion to her never truly faded. It lay buried, waiting for the rare moments when his madness cracked and his true self shone through. When Simon placed the crown upon his head for the last time, the man who had once walked through ruins with a little girl at his side began to fade. His body still carried the same shape. His voice still echoed with familiar tones. But inside, something was unraveling. The memories of Betty, of Marceline, of books and laughter and gentle afternoons became fragments scattered in a blizzard. The crown, patient and merciless, wove its will through his thoughts until the name Simon Petrikov was little more than an echo. The Ice King emerged slowly, like frost creeping across a window pane. At first there were still flashes of humanity. He would wake in strange places, clutching his head, muttering apologies to people who were no longer there. He would weep without knowing why, or hum lullabies without remembering the child he had once sung them to. These fragments haunted him, but he could not piece them together. They drifted through his mind like snowflakes, melting before he could grasp them. His outward world began to change as well. Wherever he lingered, ice took root. Towers of frozen stone rose from the ground, walls of glittering frost stretched skyward, and a palace unlike anything in the old world began to form around him. He did not plan its shape, yet it grew with eerie precision, as though the crown itself were building a throne for the king it had chosen. The Ice King wandered those halls alone, his feet echoing against the frozen floor. He filled the silence with chatter, sometimes to himself, sometimes to voices only he could hear. The loneliness pressed down on him, yet he rarely recognized it for what it was. The crown dulled the ache of memory, twisting his longing for companionship into obsession. Where Simon had once loved Betty, Ice King now longed for princess, figures of beauty and power who he believed would complete his kingdom. This obsession became his defining trait. He scoured the land of O for princesses to kidnap, convinced that if he only brought one to his palace, she would stay, and he would no longer be alone. Of course, they resisted, frightened by his madness, repelled by his strange behavior. But Ice King could not understand. In his fractured mind, he believed he was offering them safety, offering them a place in the frozen halls he now called home. The people of Oo came to see him as a nuisance, a bumbling antagonist whose schemes were more annoying than dangerous. They laughed at him, fought him off, and dismissed him as foolish. To them, he was a villain, too pitiful to truly fear. Yet behind the rambling words and the erratic actions was a tragedy hidden in plain sight. Every kidnapping, every desperate attempt to hold on to someone was the echo of Simon's broken heart, the echo of a man who had lost Betty, who had left Marceline, and who no longer knew how to love in a way that made sense. There were rare moments when the mask cracked. In the middle of his nonsense, he would pause, his eyes softening, his voice trembling. He would mutter names he did not recognize or cry without understanding why. These moments passed quickly, swallowed by the crown's madness, but they were proof that Simon still lingered deep inside. His powers, meanwhile, grew stronger. No longer did he struggle to summon ice and snow. They obeyed him instantly, bending to his will with frightening ease. He could conjure storms with a gesture, trap enemies in frozen prisons, and reshape the land itself into a winter kingdom. Yet his mastery came not from discipline or study, but from surrender. The more he gave himself to the crown, the more powerful he became, and the less of Simon remained. The Ice King's story was not one of triumph. It was not the rise of a great ruler or the glory of conquest. It was the slow death of a man buried beneath layers of frost, hidden behind laughter that no longer belonged to him. His kingdom was vast, but it was hollow. His throne was grand, but it was cold. And at its center sat a lonely figure, convinced he was king, when in truth he was prisoner. The Ice King's days settled into a strange pattern, though he never thought of it as such. He wandered the frozen halls of his palace, humming to himself, scribbling in notebooks that quickly filled with nonsense. He made up songs, short and silly, that he sang to the walls, his voice echoing back at him, as if the ice itself were his audience. Sometimes he laughed so loudly that it startled even him, bouncing through the corridors until it faded into silence. That silence was what he hated most, though he could not name it. It was in this silence that his obsession with princesses took root. The crown had twisted his memories into half-formed shapes. Where once there had been Betty, her kind eyes, her warm smile, there was now only the idea of a princess, someone who was meant to stay by his side, someone who would understand him, someone who would make his kingdom feel less empty. So he began searching, flying over the land of Oo with his great beard whipping in the wind, scanning the ground for figures of beauty and power. When he found them, he swooped down, declaring his intentions with wild energy. He promised them comfort, promised them the splendor of his palace, promised them the companionship he craved. But his madness distorted every word. To the princesses of Oo, his proposals sounded like threats. His palace was not a sanctuary, but a prison of ice. And his attempts to hold them always ended with their escape, or with heroes arriving to pull them free. The Ice King could never understand why they resisted. He believed in his fractured mind that he was doing everything right. Wasn't he offering them safety? Wasn't he giving them a castle, a throne, a crown beside his own? Why then did they always run away? Each rejection deepened his loneliness, feeding the cycle, sending him out again in search of another princess who might finally say yes. The people of Oo came to know him as a nuisance, a figure of irritation rather than true danger. Finn and Jake, in particular, found themselves crossing paths with him again and again. To them, he was a villain to fight off, a silly old wizard who couldn't stop causing trouble. They never saw the pain beneath his laughter, the sorrow hidden behind his scheme. And perhaps that was a mercy. For if they had looked closely, they would have seen the remnants of Simon Petrikov flickering like a candle in a storm. Inside his mind, fragments of memory continued to surface, though he could not place them. He would find himself singing lullabies and not know why. He would clutch his head at the sound of Betty's name, though he could not remember who she was. And sometimes, when he saw Marceline from afar, a piercing ache filled his chest, as if part of him still remembered the bond they once shared. But the crown would smother these feelings quickly, twisting them into confusion and nonsense. The Ice King's loneliness was not always quiet. It burst out of him strange fits of creativity. He wrote pages of poems, drew fantastical pictures, and even imagined whole stories where he was loved, admired, and never alone. He filled journals with these fantasies, convinced they were real history, convinced that one day someone would come along and understand them. But when he reread them, the words blurred together, nonsensical and strange, leaving him frustrated and more isolated than before. And so he leaned harder into his obsession. He sought Princess not only for companionship, but as proof that he was still someone worth loving. In his mind, if one of them stayed, it would mean he was more than just a lonely man in a frozen palace. It would mean he was a king, powerful and admired. Yet every failure left him more fractured, deepening the pit of sadness that his madness tried so desperately to cover. His power, meanwhile, only grew. With a flick of his hands, he could summon blizzards that stretched across valleys. He could sculpt soldiers from ice, creatures of frost that moved at his command. But for all his might, he had no true control over himself. His mind was a maze, and at its center was not a ruler, but a prisoner. The crown wore him more fully with each passing year, until Simon was no longer a man in conflict, but a shadow buried so deep he was nearly forgotten. The Ice King believed he was free, yet in truth he was bound tighter than ever, a captive of the very crown that gave him power. The Ice King's reputation spread quickly across Oo. In the early years after the Great War, when kingdoms were still rising from the ashes, his appearances became almost a pattern. Wherever there was a princess, sooner or later, the Ice King would arrive. Sometimes he came with grand speeches, sometimes with bumbling laughter, sometimes with a storm of snow that frightened away entire villages. The Candy Kingdom, the Fire Kingdom, the Slime Kingdom, each came to know him not as a true conqueror, but as a restless nuisance who could never be ignored for long. And so the heroes of Oo learned to push back against it. Finn and Jake, still young and full of energy, often found themselves confronting the Ice King's schemes. To them, he was an annoyance to swat away, a wizard whose powers were great, but whose plans always fell apart under the weight of his own confusion. They fought him, defeated him, laughed at him, and then, in the way of children, forgot about him until the next time. For the Ice King, each defeat was baffling. He could not understand why the princesses rejected him, why the heroes opposed him, why the world seemed determined to leave him alone. In his fractured mind, he believed he was offering something wonderful, a castle, companionship, the gift of being chosen by him. But when they screamed or fled, when they locked him away or scolded him, he only grew more desperate. The truth beneath all of this, though hidden even from him, was heartbreaking. Every time he tried to capture a princess, every time he begged one to stay, he was echoing Simon's greatest wound. He had lost Betty to time, to fate, to the inexorable pull of the crown. He had left Marceline behind because he feared what he was becoming. And so the Ice King's obsession with princesses was not born from malice, but from longing. It was the fractured echo of a man who had once loved deeply, and who no longer knew how to express it in any way but madness. There were times, rare and fleeting, when the madness cracked and Simon flickered through. In the middle of his ramblings, he would suddenly fall silent, staring into the distance as if listening to a voice only he could hear. He would mutter Betty's name without knowing why, or sing fragments of lullabies he could not place. Sometimes when Marceline appeared, he would soften, confusion clouding his eyes as if some part of him recognized. But the crown always closed around him again, smothering the clarity before it could take hold. These moments made the Ice King all the more tragic. To the world, he was a clownish villain, a lonely wizard who could not stop himself from causing trouble. But to those who glimpsed beneath the surface, he was something much sadder, a man still alive somewhere within, trapped behind walls of ice that no one could melt. The loneliness grew heavier as the years passed. He filled his days with distraction, writing in endless journals, composing songs that few would ever hear, staging imaginary conversations with penguins who waddled through his hall. Gunter, his closest companion, became more than just a pet. In Ice King's mind, the penguin was a confidant, someone who would listen without judgment. He poured his feelings into these one-sided talks, never realizing that they were echoes of the conversations Simon once shared with Betty, with Marceline, with colleagues in the world that no longer existed. The palace he built reflected his state of mind. Its halls were vast and glittering, yet empty. Its throne was tall and imposing, yet cold and lifeless. He filled it with trophies from his misadventures, scraps of clothing, trinkets, and drawings, all piled together in a chaotic attempt to make the emptiness feel full. But nothing could fill the void. Each object, no matter how precious to him in the moment, eventually became just another piece of clutter in the frozen halls of solitude. Khan, the Ice King, believed himself to be a monarch, feared and admired. But in truth, he was a prisoner, bound by the crown, surrounded by walls of his own making, and starved of the one thing he craved most, companionship. And though Simon's voice was nearly gone, it still whispered in rare moments, like the faintest sound of a man calling out from deep beneath the ice. Seasons shifted across the land of Oo, but in the Ice Kingdom, the snow never melted. The palace remained locked in eternal winter, its spires glinting like frozen teeth against the horizon. And within those walls, the Ice King lived out his endless cycle of loneliness. He woke each morning in silence, shuffled through the echoing halls, and sought distractions to keep the emptiness at bay. Sometimes he scribbled in notebooks, convinced he was recording great wisdom. Yet when he read them back, the words sprawled into nonsense, looping sentences and broken ideas. Other times he staged mock weddings, draping curtains across icy thrones and rehearsing vows to invisible brides. He played songs on his drum kit, sang ballads to penguins, and created elaborate fantasies where he was loved and celebrated. To him, these moments felt real. To anyone else, they would have looked like a man lost in the maze of his own mind. The people of Oo laughed at his antics. Finn and Jake grew accustomed to his schemes, treating him less like a dangerous foe and more like a recurring annoyance. They rolled their eyes when he arrived, swatted him away when he kidnapped a princess, and never truly feared him. In a way, this dismissal was its own cruelty. No one saw the tragedy beneath the surface. No one realized that his wild ramblings and desperate obsession were born from centuries of loss. And yet, even in his madness, Simon sometimes broke through. It might happen in the quietest of moments, when he sat alone with Gunter, and the palace was still. He would hum an old tune, not knowing why, and tears would run down his face before he understood they were falling. Or, in the midst of ranting about princesses, he would suddenly falter, whispering Betty's name like a prayer. These flashes of humanity were brief, but they proved that Simon Petrikov was not gone entirely. He was buried, hidden beneath layers of frost and confusion, but alive in fragments. Marceline, when she encountered him, felt this truth most keenly. Though she rarely spoke of it, her eyes softened whenever she looked at him. She saw past the crown, past the laughter, past the foolish schemes, to the man who had once carried her through the ruins of the old world. For her, the Ice King was not just a nuisance. He was her father figure, lost but not forgotten. And though he no longer recognized her, she never fully stopped caring. These encounters deepened the tragedy of his existence. In another life, Simon might have grown old, surrounded by books, telling stories to children, growing gray beside Betty. Instead, he wandered halls of ice and obsessed with strangers who fled from him, unable to remember the ones who had truly loved him. His power was vast, his kingdom grand, yet his heart remained empty. The crown had granted him survival, but it had stolen everything that made survival meaningful. It kept him alive, but at the cost of his identity, his love, his humanity. He believed himself a king, yet he was a prisoner bound to a role he never chose. And in the rare moments when clarity flickered through, Simon's soul wept inside him, longing for freedom he could not grasp. The people of Oo would never truly understand him. To most, He was a fool, a villain of the weak, a lonely wizard with too much time and too many schemes. But for those who looked closer, for those who caught the faintest glimpses of Simon beneath the madness, the Ice King was something far sadder, a reminder that even the kindest heart can be lost when burdened with too much sorrow. The frozen monarch who haunted Oo's skies was not the man he believed himself to be. He was the shadow of Simon Petrikov, twisted by a crown that demanded not only his power but his very soul. And though the world laughed at him, though they dismissed him strange and silly, the truth was that every laugh, every rejection, every lonely day in the Ice Palace was another chapter in the quiet tragedy of a man who once only wanted to be loved. The Ice King had become a legend in Oo, but not the kind of legend Simon would have ever wanted. His story was not told as a triumph, but as a warning. For hidden beneath the snow and ice was the truth of a man who had loved deeply, lost everything, and surrendered to the only thing that remained. And though his name was forgotten, buried under the title of Ice King, Simon Petrikov still endured, flickering like a faint candle beneath a storm of endless winter. Though the crown had buried Simon Petrikov deep beneath layers of ice and madness, fragments of him remained, flickering in the shadows of the Ice King's mind. These fragments surfaced at strange times, unexpected, fleeting, and always bittersweet. They were like cracks in the frozen walls of his mind, letting through small beams of light that reminded him, and those around him, that he was not entirely lost. One of the clearest fragments lived in his music. Ice King would often sit in his palace with a guitar in his lap, plucking clumsy notes, humming tunelessly to him. To most, it sounded like nothing more than noise, the ramblings of a lonely wizard trying to fill the silence. But every so often, a song would emerge, simple and haunting, with melodies that echoed something far older. These were the songs Simon had once sung to Marceline in the ruins of the old world, lullabies carried across time. He no longer remembered why they mattered or who they belonged to, but the music carried the imprint of his love. Marceline, when she heard them, recognized them instantly. Her eyes softened, and she knew that somewhere deep inside, Simon was still singing to her. Another fragment showed itself in his journals. The Ice King wrote obsessively, filling page after page with scribbles, drawings, and nonsense. At first glance, they were incoherent, chaotic records of his wandering mind. But hidden among the scrawls were moments of clarity. Words like Betty, Marceline, and I'm sorry appeared again and again, breaking through the noise like signals in static. He did not understand why he wrote them, or who they referred to, but his hand carried the memory his mind had lost. These journals became unintentional testaments to Simon's lingering humanity, proof that the man inside the crown still fought to be remembered. Sometimes the fragments took the shape of emotions he could not explain. In the middle of laughing or ranting, Ice King would suddenly fall quiet, his face softening, his eyes filling with tears. He would mutter about someone he missed, though he did not know their name. He would clutch at his chest, overwhelmed by a sorrow he could not trace. These moments frightened him. He did not understand why he felt such sadness, why his heart ached in ways that no magic could cure. To him, it was just another form of madness. But to those who had known Simon, it was the truest glimpse of who he really was. The most powerful fragments surfaced in his encounters with Marceline. Though he no longer recognized her as the child he once carried, something in her presence stirred memories that refused to die. When she spoke to him, his usual nonsense softened. When she sang, he sometimes joined in without realizing why, harmonizing with the songs they had shared long ago. On rare occasions, he even addressed her with tenderness, calling her little girl, the name Simon had once given her in the Wasteland. Each time, Marceline's heart ached, for she knew those were the words of her protector, slipping through the crack of the Ice King's madness. These fragments were not enough to restore him. They did not bring back the man he had been, nor did they free him from the crown, but they were reminders that Simon Petrikov had not been erased entirely. He was still there, buried beneath centuries of frost, whispering through music, through scribbles, through fleeting words of love. And though the world saw only the Ice King, Marceline, and later others who looked deeper, recognized the truth. The man and the madness coexisted, locked together in a fragile balance. The tragedy of these fragments was that they gave hope even as they reminded everyone of what had been lost. To see Simon flicker through was to know he was still alive inside, but also to know that he was trapped, unable to return fully. Each glimpse was both gift and sorrow, proof that love and memory could endure, but also proof that they could not triumph completely against the crown's grip. And so the Ice King lived with ghosts he did not recognize, carrying the weight of memory that surfaced only in fragments, haunting him like dreams that vanish upon waking. There were moments when the fragments slipped through, not just in music or in writing, but in the way Ice King behaved. On certain days, when his schemes failed or when his loneliness grew too heavy, he would abandon his palace and wander aimlessly across Ooh. He would visit old ruins without knowing why, standing in silence among crumbled towers or half-buried libraries. To him, these were simply curious places, but deep inside, Simon's soul remembered. These were the places where he had once worked, once studied, once walked with Betty at his side. His body retraced the paths of a life he could no longer fully recall. Marceline, perhaps more than anyone, saw how powerful these fragments could be. In one of their most tender encounters, she sang a song for him, her voice trembling with the weight of memory. At first, Ice King rambled nonsense, laughing, trying to turn the moment into one of his usual antics. But as her song filled the air, something shifted. His eyes grew wet, his voice softened, and he sang with her. The words seemed to come from somewhere beyond his understanding, flowing from Simon's buried heart rather than the crown's fractured mind. For a few minutes, the madness fell away, and it was not Ice King who sang, but Simon Petrikov reaching out from the cold. These moments reminded Marceline that her father figure was still there, even if hidden. It gave her hope, but it also deepened her sorrow. For every time Simon flickered through, the crown smothered him again, leaving only the confused and lonely Ice King in his place. It was like watching someone you loved trapped behind a wall of glass, close enough to touch, yet forever out of reach. Even Ice King himself sometimes felt the weight of these fragments, though he did not understand them. He would wake in the middle of the night with tears freezing on his cheeks, muttering words like sorry or Betty or little girl. He would pace the halls of his palace, unsettled, convinced that ghosts were haunting him. In truth, it was not ghosts, but his own past, rising through the cracks of his fractured mind. The crown had tried to bury Simon, but memory is not so easily destroyed. There were even times when Ice King expressed a kind of self-awareness, though he never fully grasped it. He once confided to Finn and Jake that he didn't know why he did the things he did, that he felt compelled by forces he couldn't explain. His voice trembled with something close to honesty, a rare moment when the performance fell away. Finn and Jake, still seeing him mostly as a nuisance, didn't realize the depth of what he was saying. But to those who knew his true history, it was clear. Simon was still speaking, still fighting, even in small, broken ways. The fragments also appeared in his relationships with others, though his obsession with the princesses was often played for comedy. Underneath it lay the fractured memory of Betty. Every proposal, every desperate plea for companionship was rooted in the love he once carried. He could not remember her face, but he remembered the ache of loss. That ache shaped his every action, even when he could not explain it. And so the Ice King lived in a constant state of confusion, half prisoner, half ghost. He laughed, he schemed, he stumbled through life as if carefree. But beneath it all, Simon's sorrow bled through in fragments too powerful to erase. These were the reminders that he had once been human, once been loved, once been whole. For those who cared enough to look, these fragments transformed the Ice King from a fool into a tragedy. He was not simply a lonely wizard chasing princesses. He was a man haunted by pieces of himself, forever drifting between who he had been and what he had become. Among the most poignant fragments of Simon's past were the recordings he once left behind. In the earliest days of his decline, before the Ice King had fully consumed him, Simon had documented his fears on tape. He spoke clearly then, his voice heavy but unmistakably human, warning that the crown was stealing his mind. He begged anyone who found the recordings to understand what had happened to him, to remember that he had once been Simon Petrikov. Centuries later, when Ice King stumbled upon these same tapes, he did not recognize the man who spoke. He laughed at them, dismissed them as odd ramblings, unaware that he was listening to his own voice from long ago. Yet there were moments, even in his confusion, when the sound of that voice touched something inside him. He would pause, his laughter faltering, as if a part of him remembered. Then, just as quickly, the moment would pass, and the crown's haze would return. These recordings were proof that Simon had tried desperately to preserve himself, and that somewhere deep within, his warning still echoed. Fragments also surfaced in the way Ice King related to Finn and Jake. Though they treated him as a foe, his bond with them was strangely persistent. He would invite himself into their lives, inserting himself into their adventures, seeking something he could not name. At times, he seemed to crave their company more than their defeat. He called them friends, even when they rolled their eyes or pushed him away. It was easy to see these moments as comic, but beneath them lay a deeper truth. Ice King was reaching for connection, for the companionship Simon had once known. He did not remember how to ask for love in the right way, so he stumbled through with clumsy attempts that made him seem foolish. Yet in those attempts, the shadow of Simon's longing lived on. There were rare times when Finn and Jake glimpsed something more. When Ice King spoke honestly, when his voice carried pain rather than silliness, they saw the loneliness behind his antics. They still fought him, still pushed him back. But in those fleeting instants, they recognized he was more than a villain. He was someone broken, someone who did not fully understand himself, and though they were too young to carry the weight of his history, their compassion in those moments gave him small glimmers of friendship he craved. Marceline, more than anyone, held the key to his fragment. She saw the Simon within him, even when no one else could. When she sang to him, when she confronted him, when she spoke his name with sorrow, the Ice King faltered. He might laugh it off or change the subject, but the tears in his eyes betrayed him. Their shared songs were especially powerful, for music had always been their bond. Even in his madness, the melodies drew Simon closer to the surface. It was as if the notes carried him back to the Wasteland days when he had protected her, sung her to sleep, and promised her she would never be alone. Perhaps the most heartbreaking fragment was his endless search for love. Though he no longer remembered Betty, the shape of her absence lingered. It was why he clung to princesses, why he begged for affection, why he filled his palace with trinkets and trophies. He did not know who he had lost, but he knew he was missing. That ache never left him, and it drove every act of desperation. The fragments of Simon Petrikov were scattered across centuries, but they carried weight. They were reminders that the Ice King was not just a clown or a villain. He was a man still alive beneath the frost, fighting to be remembered in songs, in journals, in half-spoken names. Each fragment was fragile, easily lost, but together they painted a picture of a heart that refused to die no matter how much the crown tried to bury it. And so those who looked closely, Marceline, Finn, Jake, and even the viewers who knew his past, saw the Ice King not as a simple nuisance, but as a tragedy. His madness was real, his actions chaotic, but within him lived a man who had loved, who had protected, who had once been whole. That man's story echoed in fragments, whispering through the storm of ice, reminding the world that Simon Petrikov was never truly gone. The fragments of Simon's memory were scattered like shards of ice, but when pieced together, they told a story of endurance. They showed that the human heart, even when buried under centuries of madness, still found ways to speak. Each fragment, every song, every scribbled word, every sudden tear, was proof that Simon Petrikov had not been erased, only hidden. Some of the most powerful glimpses appeared when the crown itself weakened. In moments of exhaustion, when Ice King had pushed his magic too far, his mind sometimes loosened its grip. During these rare hours, he could speak with clarity, his voice quieter, his manner gentler. He did not always recognize the people around him, but he carried himself differently, as though the weight of centuries pressed upon him again. Those who witnessed these moments often stood in stunned silence, realizing that the Ice King was not a creation of madness, but a man imprisoned inside his own mind. Marceline treasured these rare flashes. When salmon surfaced, even for a moment, it reminded her of the bond they had shared in the Wasteland. Yet it also tore at her heart, for each glimpse was fleeting. She could never hold on to him, never bring him fully back. She would reach out, only for the crown to smother him again. The sorrow of losing him over and over became part of her story, shaping her music, her melancholy, her strength. Through Marceline, Simon's fragments lived on not just as memories, but as song that carried his love into the world. For Ice King himself, the fragments were confusing. He did not understand why he sometimes felt overwhelming sadness, why names slipped from his lips without meaning, why the sight of Marceline filled him with emotions he could not explain. To him it felt like madness. To those who knew the truth, it was humanity fighting to survive. Even Finn and Jake, as they grew older, began to see the man beneath the madness. They saw how his loneliness mirrored their own fears of being forgotten. They heard the sorrow in his voice when he admitted he did not know why he acted as he did. Slowly, the way they treated him began to change. They still fought him when necessary, but they also pitied him, recognizing that he was more than just a nuisance. In their eyes, he became something tragic, a warning of what it meant to carry too heavy a burden alone. The fragments of Simon's memory gave depth not only to his own story, but to the world of Ooh itself. They reminded everyone that beneath the magic, beneath the kingdom, beneath the colorful adventures, there was a history of pain and survival. The world of Adventure Time was not born whole, was shaped by war, by loss, by people like Simon who carried impossible burdens into the future. His story, though hidden behind the Ice King's antics, was one of the clearest windows into that truth. And perhaps that is why the fragments mattered so deeply. They showed that even in a world of candy people and talking animals, the most powerful stories were still human ones. Stories of love, of sacrifice, of memory clinging to life, even when everything else had been stripped away. Simon's fragments reminded us that tragedy and tenderness often live side by side, and that even the silliest figure in Ooh carried a depth few could see at first glance. The Ice King continued to wander, to kidnap princesses, to sing strange songs and scribble nonsense. To most, he remained nothing more than a fool. But to Marceline, and to those who knew his past, every laugh and every tear carried the echo of Simon Petrikov. Every fragment was a reminder that he had once been a man, that he had loved deeply, and that some part of him still did. And so Simon's story lived not in grand victories or heroic deeds, but in small, fragile pieces, in melodies hummed under his breath, in the name Betty spoken without knowing why, in the way he softened when Marceline sang. These fragments were his legacy, and though they never freed him, they proved he was never fully lost. The crown had taken almost everything, but it could not destroy love. It could not erase memory completely, and it could not silence Simon Petrikov forever. His fragments endured, flickering through the storm, waiting for the day when the man beneath the Ice King might finally be remembered in full. For centuries, Simon lived in fragment, his true self buried beneath the storm of the crown. The Ice King stumbled through life as a fool, as a nuisance, as a lonely monarch of snow. Yet the truth of who he was never fully disappeared. It lingered in songs, in memories, in the quiet ache of a heart that had once loved too deeply. And so began the long road to healing, a journey not of sudden miracles, of slow, painful steps, woven through love, sacrifice, and the mysteries of magic older than Ooh itself. The crown, as it turned out, was not simply a trinket of cursed power. It was ancient, bound to the very forces that shaped the world. Its jewels glowed with elemental energy, tied to the balance of magic that stretched back to the dawn of creation. For all its promises of survival, the crown was never a gift. It was a bargain, one that demanded the mind and soul of whoever wore it. In Simon's case, the price was centuries of madness, loneliness, and despair. But the truth of the crown's origins gave hope as well, for what had been made could perhaps be undone. The first cracks in his prison came through Marceline. Though their bond had long been obscured by the Ice King's madness, she never gave up on him. Each time they crossed paths, her music stirred something inside him, pulling Simon closer to the surface. In their shared songs, the crown's grip weakened, if only for moments. Marceline's love was not enough to break the curse, but it was enough to remind Simon that he was still alive within the Ice King. It was the beginning of healing, not of freedom, but of recognition. But it was Betty who carried the greatest weight in this chapter of his story. When she learned what had happened to Simon, when she understood that the man she loved had been lost to the crown, she refused to let fate take him away. Her devotion to him was so powerful that she bent time itself, sacrificing her own place in the world to chase after. Betty's arrival in was not gentle, it was desperate, driven by a singular goal, to save Simon Petrikov. Her journey was filled with sorrow, for she found not the man she remembered, but the Ice King, rambling, confused, and unrecognized. Yet Betty's love was unwavering. She studied the crown, sought the help of powerful beings, and risked everything to understand how to free him. Where others dismissed Ice King as a fool, Betty saw Simon. Where others laughed at his nonsense, she listened for the fragments of the man she loved. Her determination was unyielding, even as the cost of her quest grew higher with every step. Through Betty, Simon's healing began to take shape, though it was not the kind of healing that came with ease. She forced the world to confront what the Ice King truly was, not a villain, not a joke, but a man consumed by forces beyond his control. And though Simon himself was too lost to see it, Betty's actions laid the foundation for his eventual release. The road to healing was long and uneven. There were victories, moments when Simon's clarity shone through, when he spoke with the voice of the man he once was, when he recognized Marceline, or when he uttered Betty's name with trembling lips. But each victory was followed by setbacks, as the crown dragged him back into madness. It was not a straight path, but a winding one, full of heartbreak and fleeting hope. Yet hope remained, for even in the darkest moments, Simon's humanity endured. It flickered in songs, in tears, in the devotion of the people who refused to give up on him. And as long as that humanity remained, there was a chance that the crown's curse could one day be broken. Betty's presence in was like a spark in the frozen silence of Simon's existence. To the Ice King, she was confusing. Sometimes he recognized her as someone important. Other times he treated her like one more stranger in a world that never stayed. But to Betty, every moment spent near him was filled with determination. She had not crossed time and space to give up. She had come to save Simon, no matter what it cost her. Her first steps were in study. Betty was a scholar like Simon, and she turned her brilliance toward the crown. She sought out answers in the libraries of in the ruins of the old world, in conversations with wizards and beings far older than herself. What she learned was terrifying. The crown was not simply cursed. It was a vessel for a cosmic will, a tool that demanded sacrifice in exchange for its power. Its design carried the fingerprints of ancient magic, older than kingdoms, older even than the mushroom war that had reshaped the earth. But Betty did not turn away. The knowledge only deepened her resolve. If the crown had been made, then perhaps it could be unmade, or at least undone. And if there was any path to restoring Simon, she would walk it, even if it carried her into danger she could barely comprehend. For Simon, though lost in his fractured mind, Betty's devotion sometimes broke through. When she spoke his name with such love, the Ice King would pause, his laughter falling away. His eyes would soften, his voice trembling, as though Simon himself was reaching toward her through the storm. He did not always remember, and the moments never lasted, but each one gave Betty hope. They were proof that Simon was still there, waiting to be brought back. Her sacrifices grew heavier with each attempt. She gave up her home, her time, her identity, as anything but Simon's savior. Her entire existence narrowed to this single purpose. For some, her obsession might have seemed dangerous, but beneath it was something simple: love. She could not bear to live in a world where Simon was trapped, where the man she loved was mocked as a fool while his true self cried out from beneath the ice. As Betty worked, the larger truth of the crown began to reveal itself. It was tied not only to ice magic, but to the balance of the entire world. The jewels within it pulsed with energies connected to the element, to creation and destruction, to forces that shaped U's very fabric. To free Simon was not only to fight against the madness in his mind, but against the destiny of the crown itself. Healing him meant challenging the oldest magics, the kind that did not give up their grip easily. The struggle was not only Betty's. Marceline, too, carried her part of the burden. Her songs and memories continued to pierce the Ice King's madness, pulling Simon closer to the surface than almost anything else. For her, healing was not about ancient magic or cosmic answer. It was about love, about remembering the man who had once protected her. Each time she sang, she reached for Simon, and though he rarely answered in full, the fragments of his voice reminded her and the world that he was still there. Together, Betty's intellect and Marceline's heart created the first true steps toward Simon's healing. One carried knowledge, the other carried memory, and between them, they wove a thread strong enough to tug him back toward himself. The road was still long, and the crown still clung to him. But for the first time since he had placed it on his head, Simon's return felt possible. And yet, with every step forward, the risks grew greater. The crown did not surrender its prisoner easily. Its whispers grew louder, its power more volatile. The closer Betty and Marceline came to freeing Simon, the more the crown resisted. It was as though the very magic of Ooh itself was fighting against their love. But neither of them turned away. For love, whether in the form of a scholar's devotion or a daughter's song, is a force older and stronger than any crown. And though Simon could not see it clearly, that love was carrying him step by step along the long and fragile road to healing. As Betty's quest stretched on, her sacrifices grew heavier. She was no longer simply a woman searching for her lost love. She became a force moving through Ooh, pulling at threads of magic others feared to touch. Her studies led her to the crown's creator, to the understanding that its jewels were not inert stones, but conduits of chaos. They had been shaped by hands lost to history, bound to preserve their wearer at any cost, even if that preservation destroyed the mind within. Betty carried this knowledge like fire in her chest. The more she learned, the more she realized how impossible her tasks. To free Simon meant unraveling not just a spell, but a destiny. The crown had chosen him, and its choice had remade the world around him. She could not simply pry it off or destroy it. She would need power greater than the crown itself, a force vast enough to undo centuries of binding. Her desperation led her to seek help from beings beyond comprehension. Wizards, demons, and entities older than Ooh listened to her pleas. Some mocked her, some warned her away, and some offered guidance tinged with danger. But Betty did not stop. Her love for Simon pushed her past fear, past reason, into realms where few dared tread. And it was there that she brushed against the presence of Galb. Galb was not a god in the way others understood gods. It was chaos incarnate, destruction without reason, a force of entropy that consumed and remade everything it touched. To most of Ooh, Galb was a whisper of terror, an ancient name never spoken aloud. But to Betty, desperate and unyielding, it was power. If the crown could not be undone by ordinary means, perhaps only chaos itself could rewrite Simon. Her choice to follow this path was not one of recklessness, but of devotion. Betty loved Simon so much that she was willing to sacrifice her own soul if it meant saving his. She accepted risks that no one else would, carrying herself deeper into Galb's shadow, even as the cost grew clear. For every step she took, she lost a piece of herself, not to madness, but to obsession. Her entire existence became bound to the singular goal of freeing Simon from the crown. Meanwhile, Simon's fragments continued to surface, pulled upward by Marceline's song, by the tenderness of her voice. When she confronted him with music, with reminders of the past, the crown faltered. He would cry without knowing why, his laughter breaking apart into sobs. Sometimes he called her little girl, the name Simon had once whispered in the Wasteland, proving that the man she loved was still there. These moments gave hope, not only to Marceline and Betty, but to everyone who began to understand his true story. But the closer healing came, the more violently the crown resisted. Its whispers grew louder, its grip more vicious. Simon's moments of clarity became painful. His mind caught between the man he had been and the Ice King he had become. He longed for Betty without knowing her name, longed for Marceline without knowing why her face filled him with sorrow. He was caught in the storm of two selves, pulled apart by love on one side and madness on the other. Betty stood at the center of the storm, unshaken. She began to prepare for the unthinkable, calling upon Golb to undo what the crown had done. It was a choice that terrified even her, for Golb was not a savior but a devourer. Yet she believed that if she offered herself fully, perhaps chaos would show mercy and release Simon. Her love was fierce enough to believe in the impossible. And so the road to healing grew darker, yet also closer to its end. Simon's story was no longer just his own. It was bound to Marceline's song, to Betty's sacrifice, and to the very forces that shaped Ooh. The man who had once been lost in ice now stood on the threshold of transformation, with the crown clinging to him and love pulling him free. The question was no longer whether Simon could be healed, but how much would have to be sacrificed to make it so. The end of Simon's long road came in a storm of chaos unlike anything Ooh had ever seen. Betty's choice to call upon Golb was not a decision made lightly. She knew that summoning such a force would cost her dearly, but her love for Simon had never been cautious. It had always been fierce, determined, willing to sacrifice everything for him. And so she stood before the maw of chaos, unafraid, offering herself to save the man she loved. When Golb appeared, the world trembled. Its presence warped the air, bent the sky, and filled every living heart with dread. Even the crown, ancient and cruel, seemed small in the shadow of such a being. And in that confrontation, Betty's love became more than devotion. It became transformation. She bound herself to Golb, becoming its vessel, so that Simon might finally be free. The crown cracked. The madness lifted, and for the first time in centuries, Simon Petrikov opened his eyes without the haze of the Ice King clouding his thoughts. He was no longer a shadow, no longer a prisoner. He was himself again. The moment was overwhelming. Simon stumbled, disoriented, his body frail, his voice trembling. The memories of centuries came rushing back. The wasteland, Marceline, the loneliness, the laughter that was not his own. It was too much to hold, yet he held it, because it was all that remained of his story. He looked to the world around him, no longer filtered through madness, and he realized he was alive. But Betty was gone. Her sacrifice had been total. She had given herself to chaos so that Simon might walk free. He felt her love in that act, stronger than any words, and yet it broke his heart. He had longed for her for centuries, and now, in the moment of his return, she had vanished. He was healed, but he was also alone. Marceline was there, though. She came to him not with pity, but with quiet love. She saw Simon, not the Ice King, not the crown's prisoner, but the man who had once carried her through the ruins of the old world. Tears filled her eyes as she embraced him, and in that embrace, Simon found his first fragile peace. He was no longer a protector, but he was still her family, and that was enough. Simon's healing was not perfect. He did not step into joy as though nothing had happened. He carried the weight of centuries, the grief of Betty's loss, the memories of the Ice King's mistakes. But he also carried love, Marceline's love, Betty's love, and the love of those who had refused to forget him. The road had been long, winding, and filled with sorrow, but at its end, Simon was no longer lost. The world of Ooh looked different to him now. The kingdoms had grown, heroes had risen, and time had marched on without him. He was a man out of place, a relic of a history most could not remember. Yet he walked through this new world with cautious steps, determined to live, to learn, to find meaning again. For the first time since the day he found the crown, Simon Petrikov was free to simply be. His healing was not a return to the man he had once been. It was the beginning of something new. He would never forget the Ice King, never erase the madness that had stolen so many years. But he would not be defined by it. He was Simon, flawed, grieving, hopeful, and that was enough. The story of Simon Petrikov and the Ice King is one of tragedy, but also one of love that refused to die. It shows that even in the darkest places, fragments of humanity can endure. It shows that memory, music, and devotion can pierce even the thickest ice. And it shows that healing is not always a clean victory, but sometimes a slow, painful, beautiful journey toward becoming whole again. Simon's story is finished, yet it lingers in Marceline's song, in Betty's sacrifice, in the quiet halls of the Ice Palace, where echoes of laughter and tears still remain. His road to healing was long, But at its end, he walked forward, carrying love with him into whatever future awaited. And now, dear listener, it is time to rest. The tale has been told, the storm has passed, and the long night stretches before you. Close your eyes, let the story fade, and drift into dreams where even the coldest ice can thaw. Good night.